Good morning. Today we look at Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 56. This is the crucifixion of Jesus. And, it's always one of those really difficult passages to read. And as I read it earlier, when we got to the point where, the one thief says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom," and Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise." I thought, that's such a bright spot in this horribly painful story. But as we begin what we look at in verse 26, they led him away, and they seized this man named Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they made him carry the cross of Jesus. And of course, John's gospel, Jesus carries his cross all the way, but this is Luke. And Simon they assumed he was a slave so that they could impress that upon him to carry this cross, but he was a free man. And so when the Roman soldiers did that, they broke the law. But that's totally beside the point. But verse 27 says, "A great number of people followed Jesus, and there were women who were beating their breasts and wailing." And and he says, "Don't weep for me, but weep for others." And then it goes starting in verse 32, where the two other criminals were led away and put to death with him as well. And in my Bible, there's a bracket around verse 34. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's one of those things we call the 7 last words of Christ from the cross. And, I remember when I first heard about that, I thought, well, what were they? And then there's more than 7 words there. That can't be it, but it was the 7 phrases that he used, and this was one. And that's such a powerful statement too. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And it's just a reminder for me of, like on a Sunday morning, before the confession and forgiveness, things we've done and undone, known and unknown, and that's forgive them for what they have done, for they do not know what they are doing. And it's just, the ability of Jesus to stay focused and to be able to still in the midst of all of this, to have the forgiving nature of God. That is so powerful, so powerful. And Jesus doesn't seem to pay too much attention to the thief or the others that are mocking him and giving him such a hard time on the cross. Verse 35 says, "The people stood by watching. The leaders scoffed at him, saying, 'He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah.'" And the soldiers mocked him. So, the crowds that were there, it was the chief priests, the scribes, the religious leaders who had been instrumental in stirring up everybody against him. And then the soldiers getting involved in it. It's, that mob mentality of what, how everything turned against Jesus that way. And the soldiers mocked him, "If you're this king of the Jews, save yourself and us," basically, But the reality is that Jesus didn't save himself. And by doing that, by not saving himself, he saved us. If he had saved himself, if he had not gone to the cross, whatever, he would have saved himself, but not for us. And these 2 criminals that he was hung between was another part of the humiliation. For Jesus, the King of the Jews, they called him, and he was and is. But to be hung between two criminals was more humiliation. And so with the centurion and the crowds and all of those mocking Jesus, the one criminal as well was mocking Jesus, and said, are you not the Savior? Save yourself and us. Well, that criminal may or may not have been saved. You know, it doesn't sound like maybe not, but the one that said, Jesus, remember me in your kingdom, you know. Jesus, look upon me with favor, you know. He said, we're guilty. This man is innocent, you know, and he had all of that going for him, you know. And it's just that reminder of when we hear Jesus' welcome to that criminal on the cross. It's a reminder for us, a promise for us that it's never too late to come to Jesus that way. Our future is dark without Jesus, but with Jesus, you know, the light is there. And, you know, the words of the saved criminal are, you know, do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? We have been condemned justly, he says, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he looks to Jesus and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And it's, I tell you the truth. Or, you know, most Bibles say, truly I tell you today, but, you know, it's, I tell you the truth, you know, verily, verily, I say unto you. This would be the old King James version, you know, but it's, I tell you the truth. This is not a lie, you know. Today you'll be with me in paradise. You know, that's quite a promise to have that way. And then verse 44 says it was about noon and darkness comes for those 3 hours. And, you know, that period of time in the history of humankind has got to be one of the darkest times that there ever could be. As Jesus was hanging on the cross, coming to breathing his last, the only time darker was after his death, that time from his death until his resurrection. I mean, that was such a dark time for humanity. And then as Jesus, you know, as the sun's light failed, the curtain of the temple tore in two, and Jesus, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. More of those, another of those 7 last words of Jesus from the cross. And then we have a statement of faith from one of the Roman centurions, one of the guards that is there. You know, he praised God and said, certainly this man was innocent. You know, certainly this man was the Christ, depending on which gospel you're reading and stuff. But that Roman guard saw in Jesus he heard the words of Jesus. You know, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You know, into your hands I commend my spirit. He saw in Jesus that trust in God, that absolute conviction that this was the right thing to be doing. And so Jesus trusted God, even though, you know, even though it sometimes didn't sound like it. But, you know, into your hands I commend my spirit. That's complete trust. And that's what we do. We completely trust ourselves into God's care. And, you know, all the crowds that had gathered returned home then, beating their breasts, you know, but his acquaintances, you know. So Luke is telling us that there were several of the acquaintances, you know, and the women had been watching from a distance. And then the final part of this chapter is a good and righteous man named Joseph, one of the Pharisees from Arimathea, came and took the body of Jesus and laid it in a tomb. And they returned, the women who had been with him and followed from Galilee saw the tomb, they saw how his body was laid, and they returned and prepared spices and ointments. And on the Sabbath, they rested, as was their custom. You know, that was the commandment of God on the Sabbath to rest. But so even though that very difficult time of reading of Jesus' death on the cross, there's, you know, the promise to that criminal, today you'll be with me in paradise. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I commend myself, my spirit, into your hands. You know, that complete trust in God. Just Jesus models for us such good faith and trust in God that way. And we know that as horrible as Jesus' death was, it is the saving action of God for each and every one of us.